when he is now in Haran working for his for his uncle Lavan. That is the place where Jacob actually sets in motion what will be his life's accomplishment. And essentially, what is that? His family. And at the time I mentioned that Jacob succeeds where the other two patriarchs failed. Abraham has one son, Isaac, who succeeds him. Isaac has one son, Jacob, who succeeds him. Both of them have other sons, but the other sons part ways, and there's a very real split in terms of the progeny of Abraham and Yitzchak. Jacob succeeds in not only having many more children, but which is clear from our Parsha, all of them ultimately come under the rubric of being the house of Israel. And that's what we see in our Parsha. And maybe what I'd like to do is begin, in fact, with the last verse, which appears by the blessings. If you look at chapter 49, verse 28. After Jacob blesses all of his sons, it says, Kol ele shiftei Yisrael shnei masar. All of these were the tribes of Israel, 12. V'zot asher diber lahem avihem, and this is what their father said to them. Vayevarech otam, and he blessed them. Ish ish kivirchato, beirach otam. Each one according to his blessing did he bless them. So again, if you now just look at this for 1 second, we have here a sharp contrast between what happened with Abraham, what happened with Yitzchak, and what's happening now with Jacob. Abraham blesses Yitzchak. But in fact, we don't even find, actually, I should backtrack for a moment. We don't necessarily find Abraham blessing Yitzchak. We certainly don't find him blessing Ishmael. We find Yitzchak blessing Yaakov, but we don't find him blessing the two sons together. Jacob now is blessing all of his sons together. Everything is up front, and they remain together from this point on. That is his crowning achievement. And that's what I'd like to examine today, the significance of his blessings and how this becomes, in a certain sense, the culmination of everything that he's worked for in his lifetime. And today I'm going to be focusing in particular on two commentaries, the Abarbanel. For those of you who are not familiar with, who lived in the 1400s, originally from Portugal, then in Spain, who wrote a major commentary on the Torah and on the prophets. The Abarbanel was also known for his accomplishments in finance, to the point where he was the treasurer of the Portuguese king, and then subsequently worked for King Ferdinand, Queen Isabella. In fact, perhaps his greatest tragedy was that he thought that he could prevent the expulsion of the Jews from Spain because of his political connections, because of his wealth, but he failed. So, and the Abarbanel I find to be a fascinating commentary, as you will see. And then the other commentary, who, for those of you who know me, is a big favorite of mine, is Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, the leading Orthodox rabbi in Germany in the mid-1800s. Okay, and what both of them share in common is that their commentaries tend to be philosophical, tend to have a certain breadth and depth, okay, at trying to see the larger picture. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. So without any further ado, I would like to begin with the Abarbanel, and I'm going to give you a kind of rough translation. For those of you who have downloaded the source sheet, okay, you could, follow me, although I'm going to be jumping around a little bit, but you'll see on my source sheet, I highlighted various things. And I would like to, first of all, give his kind of overview of how he understands the blessings. And I would also like to connect this with a number of things that we've been speaking about over the past few weeks. So he says the following. In my opinion, Jacob, at the time of his death, wanted to clarify which of his sons, or from which of his sons, will emerge the monarchy, rulership over the Jewish people. Jacob knew that he would have many, many children, and it was fitting that they should appoint upon them a leader, a king. And in order to prevent confrontation, arguments, rifts regarding the appointment of a king, the old man saw fit, this is his language, the old man, that at the time of his death, he should clarify from which tribe the leader will come, and from whom a whole chain, a whole dynasty of leaders will emerge. And as a result of that, he then searched, inquired as to the nature of all of his sons and their qualities to see who is fit to be the king. And therefore, according to the Abarbanel, although the Torah says that Jacob blessed his sons, what he says that in fact the blessings which he's giving his sons is really an attempt for Jacob to clarify who is fit to be the king, who is fit to be the leader. And in fact, as we're about to see, Jacob, the Abarbanel, will go through each of the blessings, and he will tell you how this blessing either shows how this one is fit or how they're disqualified from being the king. So that according to him, all of the blessings revolve around the question of leadership. And this is a topic we've been discussing the last few weeks, right? The leadership of Joseph, the leadership of Judah. We even discussed about Reuven. So the Abarbanel says that issue of leadership now, in a sense, comes to a head in these blessings. And so let's now examine this. And by the way, I want to start out by saying the following, that what the Abarbanel says is true, certainly according to everybody, for the first four sons of Jacob. We'll see that Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch has a different take when you get to the other sons. But at least for the moment, I'd like to at least pursue the Abarbanel's take on this. So let's start. If we look now at chapter 49, verse 3, the first son, Reuven, Bechoriata, you are my firstborn. Kochi v'reshit oni, my power, okay, the first of my strength, of my virility. Yeter sa'et v'yeter az. And so here the Abarbanel interprets this, and by the way, this is no different from pretty much all the commentaries. What he says is, you're the firstborn, And because of that, as firstborn, and not only the firstborn, the first of my virility, you had the advantage. You should have been the one who has the distinguished position. Sa'et, yeter sa'et. Sa'et in Hebrew is related to the word nasi, the idea of being lifted up. And here I might even insert Rashi's commentary, right, which says that it says yeter sa'et, you should have had more in terms of sa'et, the yeter oz, and more in terms of oz, tenacity. So Rashi says sa'et is a reference to kuhuna, to the priesthood. Oz is a reference to the monarchy, kingship. Two different positions of leadership in the Jewish people. And therefore, what if I take Rashi, kind of superimpose it on the Abarbanel, because it's not going to make a difference. I think the Abarbanel wouldn't disagree with it. What he's saying is that, Reuven, you are the natural candidate. You should have been the leader. You should have perhaps been the leader on a number of counts. You could have been the priest or the high priest, found a dynasty of priests. You could have been the one from whom a dynasty of kings comes. And then if we read the continuation, what does it say? Pachas kamayim, hasty like water, altotar. You will not have an added position. Ki alita, because you went up, mishkevei avicha, on the beds of your father. Az chilalta, then you desecrated, yitzui Allah, when you went up on my sheets. Now, all the commentaries, starting with Rashi, see this as being an allusion to what we find in chapter 35. So if you go back, chapter 35, verse 22, after the death of Rachel, who's buried near my house, Ephrata, okay, in Bethlehem. It says that when Israel settled down in that land, Reuven went and he slept with Bilhah, the concubine of his father, and Israel heard it. Now, we're not going to get into a whole discussion over here. What did he actually do, right? If we take it at face value, he slept with his father's concubine, okay? There are commentaries, midrashim, that want to, if you want to use the language, whitewash it and say that he didn't actually sleep with her, but what he did was to dishevel her bed so that in the end, Jacob could not sleep with her. And he, in effect, kind of maneuvered things so that Jacob would go to sleep with his mother as opposed to sleeping with his, right, with Rachel's concubine. Now, I just want to point out, again, I'm speaking very generally because I don't want to focus on this. That's not the focus of my discussion tonight. It's clear that Reuven did something which is very, very problematic. What I would say, and this is generally the way commentaries understand it, he was well motivated. He was, in a certain sense, defending the honor of his mother. He was willing to, as we would say, bite the bullet, that when Rachel was alive, that Jacob would treat Rachel as the favored wife. But once Rachel died, he did something which was, in a certain sense, an affront, okay, to the concubine of Rachel, as a way of trying to make the point to Jacob, okay, you should now give my mother her due respect. Now, what Jacob is saying over here is, because of that incident, you forfeited your right to an extra portion, to a position of leadership. But the phrase which I want to really focus on is pachaz kamayim. You are quick as water. And if I go by what the Abarbanel said in the very beginning, Jacob is focusing on a certain personality trait, which makes Reuven disqualified from being a leader. And that is someone who acts with a knee-jerk reaction, someone who doesn't think through the ramifications of what they do, somebody who's impulsive. By the way, what I tried to show you is that quality of Reuven is reflected in a number of things which we saw the past few weeks. On the one hand, when Joseph goes to the brothers and they see him and there's a reaction which we're going to come to in a few moments. Let's kill Joseph. Reuven saves Joseph. How? By saying, let's throw him into the pit. We can't kill him. But Reuven didn't carry it through. It was simply a stopgap measure. Because eventually what the brothers do is sell Joseph, and he seems to be beside himself, like, what happened over here? Hello? Like, if you really wanted to save Joseph, why weren't you on top of the situation until you eventually brought him back to your father? And subsequently, we find that when the brothers come down to Jacob with the food from Egypt, and then they tell Jacob that Shimon has been held in custody and how they were accused of being spies, and how the only way to somehow correct the situation is by taking Benjamin back and presenting him to the Egyptian Lord. And then Reuven says, and I guarantee his survival, because if I don't bring him back, kill my two sons. Jacob simply brushes him off, doesn't even respond to that, and simply says, no way that I'm going to let Benjamin go. And then everything just drops. So what seems to characterize Reuven is that Reuven is somebody who is well-intentioned, who does have a sense that now is the time to act, but somehow botches it up and doesn't think through, is this really the best way to handle the situation? Now, by the way, I just want to point this out right now. As we go through the blessings of Jacob, there are certain things which Jacob says that might be looking at past events that have actually happened. There may be other things, there may be many more things which are future oriented and are prophecies. And in fact, the Abarbanel at one point says you should know that these blessings which Jacob is giving are not actually something which are his voluntary blessings, but rather it's as if he is now being filled with divine inspiration and God is speaking through him. And as a result of that, that's why Jacob may be alluding to all kinds of future events, which obviously he is unaware of. And even certain events which may have happened in his lifetime, he may be speaking about, but maybe he himself is not actually aware of the full magnitude of what he's discussing. So I just want to put that out on the table right now. But whatever it is, he is actually, you could see Jacob describing actual events that have already occurred. The Abarbanel says, but this may also be an allusion to what we find later on in the book of Numbers at the very end. If you just turn for one moment, this is the book of Numbers, chapter 32. In Numbers 32, we're told of an incident of how the tribes of Gad and Reuven come to Moshe and how they ask Moshe to receive their portion of the land of Israel on the eastern side of the Jordan. And then there are all kinds of negotiations that go on. And the reason for requesting that is because they had tremendous number of cattle and because the area which they were interested in was great grazing land. And the Abarbanel notes that incident and says, once again, we see how there is a request which is being made, which is not fully thought out. By the way, I would add parenthetically that the ones who made the requests were the tribes of Reuven and Gad. But if you look throughout the whole story, you'll see that Gad, not God, G-O-D, but G-A-D, that Gad is actually leading Reuven. It seems to be that the tribe of Gad are the spokesmen. So already over there, you see that it would have made sense for Reuven to be the one who's making this request. But even there, it's like the tail which is wagging the dog. So that what seems to be is, as the Abarbanel notes, there seems to be something about the nature of Reuven, which maybe, and he says this, is actually handed down to his children, of a certain type of instability, a certain type of hastiness, impulsiveness, which disqualifies them from being leaders. By the way, I want to make one comment now, because I think it may be, relevant to a number of things we're going to be talking about. I mentioned to you that at the end of this whole section, the last verse is, these are the blessings which Jacob gave to each of his children, each one according to who he is. And I'm sure there'll be people here who will be saying that, well, what kind of a blessing is that? That's not a blessing. And you'll see even more so when we get to the next one. I mean, I could understand as we go along, but this is not a blessing. So I would like to say it is a blessing. It's a blessing for somebody to know where they really belong. It's a blessing for people to not take on more than they're really capable of assuming. And so for somebody to think that they are fit to be a leader when that's not who they are, maybe that's a blessing. That realize, okay, and accept it. By the way, I just say parenthetically, because we're going to come back to this. This seems to be a whole issue throughout the book of Breshit, and one could say the Tanakh and beyond. Whenever you have what we call sibling rivalry, and there are numerous stories in the book of Breshit where the younger son, so to speak, usurps the older son, and maybe is actually more capable than the older son, and they don't take it well. Well, maybe if they would have understood what their capabilities are and what they're really suited for, maybe that would have actually led to a much more, how should I put it, harmonious environment. It certainly would have led to much less bloodshed. But I think maybe this becomes a major theme throughout the book of Breshit, of people not necessarily knowing what their appropriate place is and trying to bite off more than they can chew. And my last point on this, and you can already see this in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve essentially wanted to be godlike, to know good and evil. Like, isn't it enough to just be a person? Like, why do you have to be godlike? But okay, I've said enough about that. So anyway, this is Reuven. So the Abarbanel says clearly he's not fit to be the leader. Look, so let's go back now to our verses. This is chapter 49, 5 and 6. Shimon and Levi. And he says the following: Shimon and Levi achim, they are brothers. Klei chamas mecherotehem. And I'll again translate this very generally. Instruments of violence are their wares, are their goods. And then Jacob says, B'sodam al tavon nafshi, in their secrets may my soul not come. In their gatherings may my honor not be together with them. In their anger they killed a man, and with their will they uprooted an ox. And then Jacob says in Pasuk 7, Arurapa, may their anger be cursed. Ki az, because it's tenacious, ferocious. Ve'evratam, which is another word for anger. Ki kashata, because it's harsh. Achalkem biYaakov va'afitzem biYisrael. I will split them up in Jacob, and I will scatter them in Israel. Okay, now, so the first thing which is worth noting is that Shimon and Levi are a pair. Okay, and which is unusual because everybody else gets their own quote unquote blessing. And in this case, right, it's a little bit hard to see how this is a blessing, right? Jacob really speaks very harshly against them to the point where the last verse, right, their anger is cursed. Okay, I will split them in Jacob, scatter them in Israel. So let's start with the beginning. And again, I'm doing now the Abarbanel. The Abarbanel says the first thing which we're told about Shimon and Levi is that they're brothers. And he offers two explanations. One explanation is brothers as in kindred souls. They are very similar types of personalities. It's not just a statement, a biological statement. It's an existential statement. They are two very similar types, so that in a certain sense, that's why he can address them as one. Because in many ways, and again, if you follow the Abarbanel's thinking, in many ways, the qualities that they exhibit are similar qualities. He gives a second explanation, which I'll discuss later, maybe with Rabbi Hirsch, and that is they're brothers in terms of their relationship to their sister, because they were the ones who defended the honor of their sister. Now, by the way, when he then goes on to talk about instruments of violence are their wares, so it's clear that he's referring to the incident that happened in Shechem. Okay, and again, for those of you, we're not gonna look at it right now, but to make a long story short, in chapter 34, there's an incident where a fellow by the name of Shechem rapes Dinah, the daughter of Yaakov. When Shimon and Levi hear about it, not only Shimon and Levi, but all of the sons, they are outraged. Okay, this is, how could our sister have been defiled? This is an affront to our family. And essentially what ends up happening, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with, is they somehow trick the people of Shechem that if they will perform a Brit Milah, that they will then allow their sister to marry Shechem. And when the people do it, then they come in and essentially they slaughter everybody in the city and take their sister. Now, the Abarbanel says what Jacob is saying to Shimon and Levi is, you acted with violence. And according to the Abarbanel, again, I'm not going to get into the whole discussion of that incident. He says that what Jacob was upset with was the slaughter of the whole city. Had they killed Shechem and taken Dinah, he wouldn't have been upset, because that would have been justice. That would have been perhaps, okay, maybe saving her in the only way to save her. But he felt that killing the whole city was completely excessive. And now, on the basis of that, the Abarbanel says the following comment. He says, this is what disqualifies them from taking a leadership role in the Jewish people. Why? Because he says the role of the king is to see that justice is done, to see that righteousness is done. But a king cannot allow violence and certainly not be the perpetrator of violence / injustice. So that according to the Abarbanel, it's clear that this is something which disqualifies them. The Abarbanel then goes on to say, and later on, we find when the Jews are in the desert, Shimon and Levi involved in two incidents, which are then perhaps an extension of this. One incident, this is in the book of Numbers in chapter 16, is the rebellion of Korach. When Korach puts together a whole bunch of followers and essentially is making a power play, okay, to oust Moshe and Aaron from the leadership position. And then subsequently, in chapter 24, we find an incident of where the Jewish people are having sexual relations, worshiping idols with Midianite women. And there's the prince of the tribe of Shimon, who then tries to somehow make a point of taking a Midianite princess, cohabiting with her, and then is again creating a certain, how should I put it, challenge to Moshe, which eventually leads to the whole tribe dying in a plague, or a large portion of the tribe dying in a plague. Now, what I would say is, if I take what the Abarbanel said, slightly shift it, what he would be saying is that the leader of the family, the leader of the Jewish people, should not be somebody who's violent, unjust, and what I would say, who's maybe constantly exercising power politics. Power should not be at the core of your leadership, the exercise of power. And one might even say, when it's the exercise of power, it inevitably will become the excessive exercise of power. So that Shimon and Levi are unfit to be leaders. Since I see my time is starting to run, and I have this tendency, so I want to jump for a minute to Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who actually has a slightly different take on this, which will actually fit into his general way of seeing these blessings. I mean, he obviously agrees that Shimon and Levi are not fit to be leaders because of what the Abarbanel said. But what he says is the following. The first thing which he says is, when Jacob says Shimon and Levi are brothers, he says it's not just, as the Abarbanel says, that they have similar qualities. But what he says is they actually have a sense of brotherhood. And what does that mean? There's a sense of the family is important to us. We will not allow an injustice to be perpetrated in the family. And as I mentioned to you in the story of Dinah, this is what seems to motivate them. Our sister was violated. The honor of the family was violated. How can we just stand by? Which means that there are people who are motivated for a higher purpose, for the good of the family, so that they do have, it's not that there are people who are interested in power, okay? Because generally when we think about power, we think about ego. It's not ego which is motivating them. It's actually a very noble principle, the honor of the family. Except that there's one problem. And the problem is they're fanatics. They're extremists. They're zealots. So what Rabbi Hirsch says is a very interesting comment. He says that when Jacob says their anger should be cursed, Jacob never says they should be cursed. It's their anger, which means that Jacob is looking for a way to somehow channel, temper their, we would call enthusiasm, their zealotry, their fanaticism. And so what he says is when Jacob says, I will split them up in Israel, I will split them up in Jacob, and I will scatter them in Israel. So he says the following, and I'm paraphrasing this, so you'll, for those of you who actually check it out, I'm paraphrasing it. He actually says that zealotry in small doses is actually a very positive thing. The problem is when it becomes concentrated. So then he makes the following comment. The comment is that when the Jewish people are in the land of Israel, it's critical that Shimon and Levi have to be scattered. And for those of you who know, Levi didn't actually have a portion in the land of Israel. The tribe of Levi had 48 cities which they were given, scattered throughout the land of Israel, 4 cities in each tribe. Shimon did not actually have, in a way, a portion of his own, but his portion was subsumed under the portion of Judah. And essentially what Rabbi Hirsch is saying is, when the Jewish people are in the land of Shimon, in the land of Israel, excuse me, Shimon and Levi do not have a land of their own, and certainly not contiguous to each other, because by having land, that would give them a power base. And if they had that power base, then that could actually lead them to doing things that could be extremely destructive. However, by being scattered among the Jewish people, that actually has an advantage when the Jewish people are in exile, when they're in the diaspora. And it's fascinating, when you read Hirsch's commentary, you could see that this is, although he's in Germany, but you could see that this is a Galut Jew who is speaking, right? And he says, when Jews are being stepped on by all kinds of European ruffians, you need someone who's going to be able to lift up their head and give them Jewish pride and to tell them, stand up for yourself and don't just allow yourself to be trampled on. Right? I used to say this when I would teach in Pardes, right? And I think that the crowd here, right, will, I don't know if you'll agree with what I have to say, but at least, you'll understand what I'm talking about. Rabbi Meir Kahana, when he started his career, he started it as the Jewish Defense League. And everybody here, I'm sure, knows, right? He is generally known as the archetype of a fanatic, of a zealot. But in fact, when he started out, the Jewish Defense League essentially was a way to protect elderly Jews who lived in Brooklyn to be able to walk safely on the streets. Jews who were being mugged, who were being robbed, Okay, we set up a kind of patrol to protect them, to allow them to just live normal lives. Subsequently, he was a major figure in the struggle to free Jews from the former Soviet Union. He was very, very outspoken. But what was he doing? He was trying to somehow plead the cause of Jews, right? Who are in effect being deprived of their most elementary rights, right? To be able to go where they would like to live. All of a sudden, when he moved to Israel, so what I used to tell my students is the Jewish Defense League became the Jewish Offense League. And then all of a sudden, it became very problematic in terms of things that he said, and you might even say the hatred which he spewed towards the Arab populations, but now you're living in a place where you have power. And by now taking this very fanatical position, that can be very, very destructive. So this is what Rabbi Hirsch says. Jacob's statement to Shimon and Levi, in a way, is an actual blessing. It's saying you have a quality which is actually can be a very positive quality. Zealotry says that you're very passionate about things, the principles you believe in. But the problem is it tends to be excessive. It can be extremely destructive. So what Jacob says is by dividing, I can now channel it in a way where it's going to be constructive. But to go back to the Abarbanel, zealots, fanatics, cannot be leaders or cannot be leaders in a sovereign state. And by the way, Rabbi Hirsch makes this point. It's not only, as the Abarbanel says, you're not fit for leadership. If you're going to be a leader, it'll be absolutely devastating and destructive. So you're totally disqualified from leadership. So now we come to number 4. So let's look at the verse. This is chapter 49, verse 8. Yehuda, ata yoducha achecha, you, your brothers, will acknowledge. Yadcha, your hand, is ba'oref oivecha, on the nape of your enemies. Yishtachavu lecha b'nei avicha. Your father's children your sons will bow down to you. Gur Aryeh Yehuda, Judah is like a cub, a lion cub. Miteref, teref is from the prey. B'ni alita, you rose up. Kara, you bowed down. Ravatz karyeh, you crouched as a lion. Uchlavi, and as a lioness. Mi yikimenu, who can raise you up? Who can pick you up? Lo yasur shevet mi Yehuda, the scepter will not depart from Judah. Umechokek, and the lawgiver mi bein raglav, from his feet, until he will come to Shiloh, and until nations will gather. Okay, now, so what I want to do, and since I'm, as I said, continuing along the lines of the Abarbanel, the Abarbanel says that when Jacob comes to Judah, so it's very clear that Judah is the one who has the qualities, who has the properties that are fit to make him the leader. And then what he says is, Judah has 4 qualities which were listed over here, which make him the one who's fit to be the leader. The first one, Ata yoducha achecha, your brothers will acknowledge you. The sons of your father will bow down to you. Which means that according to the Abarbanel, the most fundamental thing of leadership is the acknowledgement of leadership. And the Abarbanel says that the most reasonable thing, as we have seen in many stories in Breshit, is that there's a tremendous rivalry among brothers. And by the way, not only in Breshit, you certainly see this throughout. Rivalry is to who is the leader. And especially when you have older brothers who are usurped by younger brothers, they're not prepared to accept that. So that what the Abarbanel says, the first aspect of leadership is the acceptance of leadership. And by the way, we saw that. If you recall in chapter 37, when Judah makes the proposal to sell Joseph into slavery, it says the brothers listen, the brothers accept him. And as we saw last week also, Judah seems to take on a certain leadership role. The brothers allow him to be the spokesman. The brothers follow him. So that's the first quality which the Abarbanel cites. The second quality is success in war. Your hand will be at the nape of your enemies, which means they will be running away. You will be in hot pursuit. Judah clearly has those qualities, right, of being able to succeed in warfare, which unfortunately is something which, given the realities we live in, or what's always been, a necessity for a leader to be able to succeed on the battle, in the battlefront. But he says Judah has a third quality, and that Judah is like a cub. And it's interesting that, again, I am not familiar enough, so I plead ignorance about the nature of lions and cubs. But the Abarbanel says that cubs, when they tear apart something, tend to be very, very vicious, very aggressive. But what he says is, Judah, you were like a cub, but you didn't act like a cub. And this would be an allusion to, again, the story of the sale of Joseph. Hypothetically, had Judah said at that point, let's kill Joseph, the brothers would have clearly followed him. He could have done it. They could have eliminated Joseph. But Judah didn't do it. He rose up from the prey. Rather than being vicious, he did something which was the lesser of two evils. They sold him. Which means that on the one hand, that here is Judah, who has this capacity, even if he has the ability to exercise his power, to not necessarily do it. But then he gets to the last one, which is, you bow down, you crouch down like a lion. And he says the idea being that when the lion is just lying down, right, which would be an allusion to a time of peace when there are no wars, he still generates an awe. He doesn't have to be afraid of anybody because everybody recognizes that's the lion. You don't want to start up with the lion, which means that Judah's prowess is not only in a time of war, but it's also in a time of peace. And so what the Abarbanel says is that when you look at it from every different angle, okay, Judah is fit for leadership. And the Abarbanel goes on to say that clearly here we have an allusion also to what happens later on. King David spent his whole life engaged in warfare. He is the model of the one whose hand is on the nape of his enemies. Solomon is the model of the lion who is crouching. who doesn't have to be afraid of anybody, who generates a sense of awe in peacetime. Both of them are descendants of Judah, and both of them embody the qualities of Judah. If I had to maybe paraphrase it slightly, in times of war, Judah has the courage, the tenacity to wage war to the end, ruthlessly. But when I say ruthlessly, not in a negative way, but the idea being without fear. But Judah also has the capacity that in a time of peace, to be able to make peace and to not be afraid. That also, in Israel especially, they speak about this, right? The peace of the bold, of the courageous, to not be afraid to make peace, to not be afraid, but if I make peace, then, but maybe they'll take advantage of that, but to feel confident enough in yourself, okay, that you can make peace. To also feel confident in yourself, that when an opportunity presents itself to maybe be ruthless, but you could be magnanimous, to be able to be magnanimous. That's Judah. And then the Abarbanel, as many commentaries say, the last verses here, which speak about Shiloh, are an allusion to messianic times. And in effect, what they say is the leadership in Judah will always be, and this is the Abarbanel, by the way, who says this, from this point on, Judah will always be the leader. Okay, and again, I want to just maybe, since I see my time is starting to run out, Judah will be the leader when the Jewish people are wandering in the desert, when they arrange themselves in the encampment. Judah is the first one to travel. When the Jewish people enter the land of Israel, Judah is the one to go first into battle. Then you have King David. Then you have the whole Davidic line, which continues to exist throughout the First Temple period. Even when the Jewish people go into exile, the leadership of the Jewish people is from the tribe of Judah. The Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, in the post-Second Temple period, is from the tribe of Judah. The Exilarch in Babylonia is from the tribe of Judah. The Abarbanel even goes so far as to say that all of the leaders in our time, throughout history, have all been from the tribe of Judah. So that according to the Abarbanel, what Jacob is saying is, Judah is the one who's destined to be the leader. Now, by the way, I'll just say this now. The Abarbanel says that we would have expected Jacob to have said that Joseph is the one who's going to be the leader, because Jacob really saw Joseph as the favored son. And this is why the Abarbanel says that Jacob is speaking now not as Jacob, but as the medium of prophecy. God is speaking through Jacob and saying, Judah will be the leader. Now, just to kind of finish out the Abarbanel, and I'll make one comment about Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. After Judah, the Abarbanel goes through every single son and shows how whatever we're told about them makes them unfit to be a leader. So he says Zvulun is somebody who's involved in commerce. Don't mix business with politics. Businessmen shouldn't be politicians. I imagine some people here would agree to that. Okay? He says businessmen, their interest is to make money. Politics, being a leader, is a whole other ball game. Then he says Yisachar, his understanding of Yisachar is he's somebody who's involved in agriculture. Okay? And what we would call the backbone of the economy. Okay? those people should not be leaders. They should be involved. And then he goes through every single one. By the way, the one thing which I just will comment on, Joseph, if you read his thing, Jacob speaks about Joseph at length. And if anything, the Abarbanel says he has all the qualities, clearly, of what it takes to be a leader. He has what we would call managerial skills. He also has self-control. He has principles that he lives by. According to the Abarbanel, what disqualifies Joseph as the leader is because he says Joseph never received the acknowledgement of his brothers. At the very beginning of the story, the brothers hate him. And as I mentioned last week, but you can again look this up, in the last psukim, the last verses of this week's Parsha, after Jacob is buried, you see that the brothers still are very wary of Joseph and even come to him and say that Jacob gave as his last legacy that you should not do anything to us, which means the brothers never really fully accepted Joseph, trusted Joseph, and certainly never really accepted him as their leader. And this is what the Abarbanel says. So despite all of the very favorable qualities that Joseph has, but maybe the most critical element, which is the acceptance of one's leadership, that he was never able to really achieve. So in any case, I tried to show you the Abarbanel's take on these blessings. I just want to end by saying, Rabbi Samsel Rafal Hirsch essentially follows the Abarbanel through Judah. But what he says then departs ways from the Abarbanel. And this is what I would like to end with. What he says is that, yes, for the first four sons, we were examining who is fit to be the leader. But after we've established the fact that Judah is fit to be the leader, when we go through the other sons, we essentially, Jacob is looking at what qualities do they display which will ultimately be their contribution to the national effort. And so what Rabbi Hirsch is saying is that the blessings are not just about leadership. The blessings essentially are, and you could already see this in what he said about Shimon and Levi. What does each of the sons have to contribute to the well-being, to the development of the Jewish people as a nation? What is it that they uniquely have? And so that's why Rabbi Hirsch says, when we're told Zvulun is in commerce, that's not a way to explain why he shouldn't be the king. On the contrary, that's explaining what he can contribute to the Jewish people as a people. Jews need to have people who are involved in commerce. Asher, I'm sorry, not Asher, Yisachar. Yisachar, they're in agriculture. But not only are they in agriculture, but according to the rabbinic understanding, and it's based on certain verses, they were also a certain spiritual leadership. In fact, what Rabbi Hirsch tries to show is, even from the Psukim, how what Yisachar had was to be able to work the land, but to not see work as their life's goal. The work was so that they would also be able to have what we would call leisure time, but leisure time not to just have leisure time, but leisure time to engage in Torah study. And so that they became the model of the people who work and also study Torah, who also give a certain spiritual base to the nation. And then he goes on with each of the sons. And by the way, he speaks about Joseph being a leader. But Joseph is a different leader. He's a leader who has great managerial skills. But in a sense, what Rabbi Hirsch is saying is Jacob's legacy to his sons is essentially look at yourself closely in the mirror. See what it is that you have that's unique to you, which in the end only you can give to the furthering, to the well-being of the Jewish people. With the idea being that if each one of his sons would be able to maximize what was unique about him, the conglomerate of all of them would then create a very, very powerful, very successful Jewish people. And this is his legacy to his sons. Be able to find a way to perhaps subdue each one of you their ego, to be able to say, what is it that I have to contribute? What is it that I can now do as a complement to what everybody else has? And were each of the sons to really focus on that, in the end, they could all then come together and make a very, very cohesive and intensive Jewish nation. And I would like to end by saying that I think this is something which becomes an extremely important message today for us, and certainly for us, I would say, who are living in the land of Israel, who are involved, right, in building this Jewish state. The land of Israel is the ingathering of the exiles. Many, many different types of people, many different types of cultures. Each one has something to contribute in a very powerful way. And especially now with the politics that we have, which is fascinating, okay? Not everybody is a general. You need foot soldiers too. And the question becomes, to what extent is it that we're able to actually, as a nation, place a value on every aspect of what goes on in our national culture, to be able to say that this is an intrinsic element, and to not necessarily make a value judgment of these are the people who are really these are the people, right, who are just parasites or second rate. If we can find a way to have each one maximize what they're good at doing and then integrate each of those people, that will be our strength. And that will be how, in the end, we can become a light to the nations and actualize this vision of Jacob, L'achrit hayamim. Shabbat shalom, everyone.